Welcome. With me today are Dan Kardokas and Benedicia, and we wanted to address a probably, I wouldn't say perhaps, but probably controversial subject of sexuality as related to people with disabilities. And in this discussion, I wanted to begin by distinguishing, if I could, between, or recognizing that there is a distinction between sexuality and sexual activity. You know, that's something, there may be a particular disability that has a direct limiting effect upon sexual activity. But sexuality, I think, is something much more internal.
Well, you know, the only thing is, I'm not sure that I totally agree with what you're saying as a limit on sexual activity, because, again, that's what people are thinking.
Mm-hmm.
And a very clear example of that is I had a friend in Durango that he was a cerebral palsy quadriplegic.
Mm.
And he had a love affair with his attendant. And they got married. And he fought to get into college. You know, he did a lot of things, but he was very limited. But I'll tell you one thing, he was able to have a child. And another person, Ed Roberts, who is the founder of the independent living movement, when he was 15, I think, or something. Anyway, he came down with polio so bad that he ended up in an iron lung. And he is still very involved. When we talk about involved, we're talking about a respirator. He is on tubes, the whole 9 yards. And he made the statement, he says, the greatest achievement I have is when a child comes up to me and calls me daddy. Because he was able to have a child. And yet,
so you're saying the limitation probably only exists in other people's minds.
Right.
The whole point being, your limitations should only be based on your own true personal limitations, not on what somebody else tells you that they have to be. Here's the silly
Well,
part.
and in the same way, you don't telegraph what you think somebody else's limitations are onto them. Because they are the only one who can decide what their true limitations are.
Yeah, but I mean, there are silly things like I forget what they're actually called, but the people who turn out all the Braille books. They will not translate into Braille anything that talks about sexual activities. And we're not talking about they won't translate hustler. We are talking about if it mentions sex, they will not translate it. Why? Just because you're blind doesn't mean there's anything else wrong with you. Even if there is, so what? That's not the point.
If that kind of censorship existed in any other context, I think the majority of the population would scream.
Oh, sure. They'd have hissy fits about it.
And I think that one of the most dramatic films I ever saw was when Sean Cassidy, and I don't remember who the other person, the girl was, but he portrayed a developmentally disabled young man who fell in love with this girl, and they had the mentality of junior high kids, and they fell in love. Well, then everybody got into an uproar because they wanted to get married. Well, if they wanted to get married, what about their kids? Can they handle
what about their kids?
You know, they can't handle their kids. I'm talking about, this is in the 70s that they're talking about this, and this film is coming out, and it just blew me away.
But how did they know that this couple would not be able to handle their kids?
They didn't. But the pressure finally made the decision that they would not have children. Another case in point, Judd for the Defense, an old movie. You remember Judd for the Defense? They had a couple on that both parents were hearing impaired. They were deaf. And they had a hearing child. You remember the story? And the thing happened, they lost custody of their child because the courts decided that they could not have sense enough to take care of the child who was hearing and they were deaf.
As a matter of fact, I lived that one. I used to babysit a couple. Both of them were profoundly deaf. They had 3 children. And they had all kinds of the niftiest little inventions all over the house to let them know when the kids needed anything from the parents. They had lights on everything. They even had sound-activated lights for when the kids were little tiny babies. They had sound-activated lights and little buzzers and little, you know, like the pagers do now, where they
Vibrating kind of?
Yeah, the vibrating kinds of things. All kinds of stuff. Their house was rigged top to bottom. And you have never seen a more loving, caring, kinder, more sensible set of parents in all of your life. And the kids were doing exceptionally well. And they didn't have any problems learning how to talk or anything else of that nature. No problems whatsoever. But for about 3 years while I was babysitting for them, they were going through court case after court case after court case, where some, you know, rights group would decide, no, these people are not capable of being parents because their only problem was they were both profoundly deaf. But they were not capable of having children, these groups would decide, and they would take them to court and have the kids taken away from them. So these poor kids would be dragged out and stuck in foster homes while the courts were deciding, and then they'd get them back because the court would say, no, these people are good parents. And they'd go back and forth and back and forth and back and forth, and it finally went all the way up to the state Supreme Court. At which point, they had just had the kids taken away from them for about 1.5 years. Because a lower court had decided they were incapable of being proper parents. And the state Supreme Court finally said, this is ridiculous. There is nothing to show that these kids are in any way being damaged. They show up, you know, on all the psychological tests and all the learning tests and everything. They all show up as doing exceptionally well. This is not a problem. Leave these people alone. Or we will find lawyers for them and you guys will get sued. But this had been dragging on for years at this point. And it was the saddest, stupidest thing, because these poor kids, other than the fact that they never knew when a stranger was going to come to the door and say, pack up the kids, they're going away. Other than that trauma, those kids had not a problem in the world. That's silly.
Just for the sake of asking, to argue the other point, I guess. I'm thoroughly in agreement with your apparent opinion on that case. If it were a situation in which the couple did not have the finances to buy all this gadgetry, so they had absolutely nothing.
Oh, he made them.
He made them himself.
Yeah. He went down to the local Radio Shack or whatever it was and invented all of this stuff. Now, granted, maybe another couple would not have this kind of access to that sort of thing, but I have worked with deaf people before, and they always find ways around it.
You work with the Colorado Cross Disabilities Coalition. Am I correct in assuming that at least through that organization, if not some organization that organization knows of, there is some resource that any disabled person could access to find whatever things were needed to deal with whatever concerns might come up?
Well, I've got one more on you. There's the Colorado, there is, in every state, there is a program called the Independent Living.
Which responds to every single criteria that comes out?
Yes.
Okay.
And if they have a need, then there is monies available, or there is a lot of, Colorado Cross Disability Coalition, in the Independent Living Center, like the Denver Center for Independence, ADAPT, Atlantis Community, they are pros at getting the things that are needed, because they're saying that people need to be able to live normal lives just as anybody else.
So it's not a question of the resources not being there or of them even being hard to find.
No.
No, it's the worry that people who have anything wrong with them might actually try and have real lives. I don't know what the problem seems to be.
Well, you
That
see, the
seems to
other
be
thing
attitude.
too, the other thing though too, is that anytime that there is one, so to speak, bad parent in one group, that's the ones that they're going to always look at. They don't stop to think that there is how many unfit parents that are not disabled, that are out there, and the kids are allowed to run free and have all of these problems.
That's the double standard of the news media in our society. You know, if anyone who's mentioned in the news reflects any particular minority you can point to, you know, disabled, gay, lesbian, a person of color, whatever, suddenly that person is somehow representative of the whole group. And I'm going, yeah, right. But anytime the person is not a member of any such minority, oh, it's just another weirdo down the block. Doesn't mean anything.
And I will tell you one thing too that I found out. Whenever a child grows up in a disability home, and you could probably say this as much as anybody else, they're more true than not. There is a more keener sense of understanding the world as a whole and being able to work with. It's easier to work with it. My sister-in-law, she came from a family where they had 7 kids, and 5 of the 7 kids after birth became totally deaf, and even a couple of them even were blind, and it was all after birth effects. And she's the most caring, loving sister that anybody could have. Not only that, but she has nieces and nephews from her parents, her brothers and sisters who are deaf. And I think that it's a fallacy where people think that sexuality is not going to be an issue in a person's life.
Well, more so as it become equipped and integrated in society. You know, when it's not just that sibling or that nephew or whoever who's locked up in the bedroom and we just take care of him as time goes on, but suddenly it's someone who is present at all the family functions, has their own job, has their own apartment. You know, of course sexuality is going to come right in the middle of the whole thing.
Well, another thing is, in the olden days, and I'm saying olden days 20, 30 years ago, when people were in state schools, you know how most of those people learned sexuality was from rapes, male and female. And
rape is not sexuality.
I know.
No, it's got nothing
But
to do with it.
then,
Yeah, but I want to be sure we're clear
but
on
what
that.
I'm saying that, but then they are taken out of state school and put into mainstream society, America. What is going to be their basis of
Well,
understanding?
regard- regardless of
Any
dis-
exposure to what might be classified simply because of the equipment used as sexual activity. If the only thing they know is rape, what are they going to do? And then where you get the stereotype of the retarded child who goes around doing something really obnoxious.
If it's all they know, it's all they know.
Yes, exactly.
You know, unfortunately, well, I mean, it can work both ways. It can be fortunate or unfortunate. In my estimation, what you grow up with through the first 5 to 10 years of your life becomes, until you reconstruct it, your definition of the word normal.
And how many people are capable of sitting down and examining who they are, what they are, how they think, and then saying, I don't like this part. Let's fix that one. And I don't think. This is their parents. This is their siblings. This is their relatives. This is their friends. And if you take a part of you that is too important and say, I can't live with this, and start over, you're also losing your parents, your siblings, your relatives, your friends.
Because they're all tied into that thing that you just
And
discarded.
you've just said, you are bad people.
Not only that, but how many communities have fought hard to keep people from being mainstreamed into their communities, people with disabilities, and they always use the excuse, oh, they're going to rape our children, they're not going to take care of our children. And
Well, that's,
again, but
Again-
that's the way they learn their sexuality.
yeah, reflects back to a conversation we had earlier that it's dealing with the consequences, not the source of where all this started. The only reason those kids might have that idea is because that's the definition of normal that they were given.
You know.
But the other thing that's running alongside my head as we're discussing this is, regardless of disability, we're talking about a person who has undergone psychological, emotional trauma and has never been treated for it.
And not only that, but then there's the other side. We talked about the hard side, but then there's the other side. They almost think that a person with disabilities is incapable of feeling the emotion, the love, the care of another human being.
Mm-hmm.
Or if they do, it's not something that lasts. When my youngest brother, there was a young lady in the school where he was. They were very much in love with each other. They talked about getting married.
Mhm.
I said, absolutely not. We are not going to deal with this. Neither one of you can live on your own. You're not getting married. Forget this, that you're just being silly. Denying the fact that the kids had any sexual, here I am calling them kids because that's what I hear from everybody else about these people.
Mhm.
They're both of them almost 30 years old. And they're not kids. They are adults. They have adult feelings. They have adult knowledge.
And they have
Much as
adult
anybody-
bodies.
Yes, as much as anybody may deny it. They have all of these things.
Mm-hmm.
And to deny them the knowledge to create the discipline that every other adult has or should have,
The self-discipline.
yes, is downright stupid. And then on top of that, she died unexpectedly.
Mm-hmm.
It turned out that she had a heart condition that nobody knew about. So she died very, very suddenly. And the first thing that anybody tells him to inform him of her loss was to say, "No, don't cry. She died peacefully." Don't what? And one day later, everybody is acting as if he's supposed to have forgotten about her.
Mm-hmm.
One day, I talked to him that night. And here he is trying, because everybody expects him to act like nothing happened. So he's trying to be the usual life of the party that he always is. And the day before, he has just found out that she's dead, and nobody even talks to him about it to find out that he thinks he might be responsible.
Mm.
I
Goodness.
mean, you know, talk about not being allowed to grieve. Not only not being allowed to grieve, but not even being allowed to talk to somebody, get out all of the issues that are connected with her death, so that somebody can find out that this is what he's thinking and let him know that he's got nothing to do with it.
The other thing,
But that situation untreated or unresponded to, from a layman's perspective,
It turned disastrous.
well, and that's a major psychological trauma when you're blaming yourself for someone else's death.
Mm-hmm.
and on top of that, then we have a government that is not conducive to family relations. You're taught in the government that a person with disabilities shouldn't be married. And I'll tell you, give you a good case in point. When I became disabled,
Mm-hmm.
my wife said, well, we're going to be able to get aids for dependent children before anything else.
Mm-hmm.
We went down to the social services. We had filled out everything. I was in the process of being declared disabled. And here the social service says you have one of two choices. Either you have to be declared disabled, which I hadn't been yet, or you and your wife have to split up. Those were the only two issues. And now there are so many people that are disabled that they have a marriage relationship, but they have to call them cohabitating. Cohabitating, because if they ever said that they were married, they would lose their income that they desperately need for their medical services and everything else. And it's an issue, you know, and we talk about same-sex marriages, saying we need to have the rights for same-sex marriages, that they, you know, two people of the same sex can have the same caring relationship as any human being can have. But then you add disability, and it's like, it doesn't matter what sex you are, you just don't have the rights.
No, if you are disabled, especially if you are disabled to the point where you are needing any sort of outside, especially financial assistance, you might as well take all of the equipment and put it in a box and put it away, because you're not supposed to use it ever again. You're not supposed to think about it. You're not supposed to have it. You know, it's like the old joke about if you go into government, they take your brains and put it in a trust someplace until you quit.
You'd think so sometimes, to watch the way policies are formed and laws are written. Goodness.
But see, the whole idea.
The whole thing to me seems to come back to my protest, I guess, that a person is a person is a person. And somehow we have such a hard time starting with that.
Especially if you're male, even if the equipment doesn't work, that does not mean that intense affection from your significant other is not a good thing.
Which I guess is what I was thinking of at the beginning of this episode when I referred to sexuality. And I guess at that point it's appropriate to apologize for my own misconception that there was more of a limitation to sexual activity than I thought, I guess.
There's only one limitation, and I'll use the word, whether or not you can have an orgasm.
Yeah.
Whoopee, you know, even among people with no disabilities or handicaps whatsoever. One of the nicest things to be able to do with your significant other is to just lay there and cuddle.
Yes.
Do you think this might be a reflection on American society in that we have so overvalued sexuality that there might somewhere be an inkling that it's considered the prized possession of the, what's the word? Well, essentially I'm thinking of a non-disabled person, but it seems like the way the laws have been written and the way society conducts itself, there's this conscious or subconscious idea of privilege that goes along with being non-disabled.
Well, I will tell you something too that I think, and of course I bring a whole different aspect of it, and that is I'm HIV positive. And a couple of years back my mother was talking to me, and she was well-meaning and everything else. She said, well, unless God heals you, you'll never have another meaningful relationship.
Oh, please.
Well, I'm not sure what the two...
But I'll tell you something. I just got finished losing a very special person. I know, I haven't finished that relationship, but on Earth, the physical part of it, we never had what people would call, quote, a sexual experience. And yet we were very close, and we were very knitted, and, you know, sometimes it was just massaging his feet because he was in so much pain.
It's the
And
difference.
those are, to me, sexuality is more than just orgasm. You know.
There's a kind of intimacy and a kind of being there for people. But
There's sexuality, sensuality, and love. And sometimes they're all together, and sometimes they're in discrete little pots. And you can have sex without having any love whatsoever.
afraid we're just about out of time here. Final comment to leave our viewing audience with as we wrap up the subject?
One person with disabilities told me to say, let everybody know that we are not asexual.
And that's the best way to end. Thank you for joining me.